The bittersweet river ran silver and slow at first light, breathing a low mist across the cottonwoods. And there in the middle of that cold autumn current stood a woman in black, knee-deep, perfectly still, her mourning veil trailing on the water, like spilled ink that refused to dissolve. 3 years and 4 months she had worn that veil in the town of Stillwater Bend, and folks had stopped asking when she'd take it off, because of sorrow that long stops being grief and starts being a shape a person lives inside. But on this particular morning, a tall drover on a roan horse reined up on the gravel bank, took off his hat, and spoke 6 words that the wind nearly stole away, 6 words that would change everything. If tales of brave hearts and quiet healing stir something in you, ride a little closer to the fire here at Cowboy's Steel Ridge Settle-In, and let this story carry you all the way home. To understand why a woman would stand in a freezing river before sunrise, you have to ride back a few years and walk softly through the rooms of her life, because Adeline Voss had not always worn black, and she had not always been quiet. Once, in a clapboard farmhouse on the green edge of Cedar Hollow, Kentucky, she had been a girl named Adeline Whitfield with hair the color of late wheat and a laugh that her father said could coax a cardinal off a fence post. She had grown up on hymns and apple butter, on long porch evenings when her mother read aloud from a worn book of Scottish poetry, and on the soft conviction, planted deep in her young heart, that goodness in this world generally went rewarded if a body waited long enough. It was a beautiful belief, and it was the first thing the world taught her to lay down. She was 20 when Thaddeus Voss rode through Cedar Hollow on a bay stallion with a silver trimmed saddle and a smile that seemed to know every secret a woman had ever kept. He was a cattle broker out of Kansas, 10 years her senior, polished as river stone, and he courted her the way a hunter walks up on a doe, slow, patient, never once letting her see the iron beneath the velvet. He spoke of building a great ranch in Montana Territory, of a white house with a wide porch where their children would chase fireflies, and Adeline, who had never been farther west than Louisville, mistook his ambition for tenderness and his charm for love. They were married under the dogwoods that April, and within a month she was on a westbound wagon, watching the only home she had ever known shrink to a green thread on the horizon. The truth of Thaddeus Voss revealed itself slowly, the way a deep wound shows itself only when the bandage finally comes off. The White House never came. Instead, there was a drafty homestead on a hard parcel of land outside Stillwater Bend, and a husband who drank too much and gambled worse, who borrowed against her dowry, who smiled at strangers and grew cold the moment the door closed. He never raised his hand to her, but he had 1,000 quieter ways of making a woman small. Sharp words at supper, long silences at breakfast, a habit of correcting her in front of company until she learned to stop speaking in company at all. The neighbors saw a handsome couple riding to church and assumed all was well, because the West, for all its open sky, has always been good at hiding what happens behind closed shutters. The one bright candle in those years was a daughter, born on a snowy February morning and named Eliza May after Adeline's grandmother. For 7 months, that baby was a whole sun and a whole moon and every star Adeline still believed in. And then came the fever that swept through the territory that autumn of 1875, a fever the doctor in Stillwater Bend could neither name nor stop, and little Eliza May was gone before the first frost, buried in a small pine box beneath a cottonwood that Adeline could see from her kitchen window. Thaddeus, who had barely held a child in life, did not weep at the grave. He told his wife, in a voice flat as river ice, that they would simply have another, and Adeline understood in that moment that something inside her marriage had died long before her daughter ever did. The end came 8 months later in a fire that started, the sheriff said, from a knocked-over lantern in the barn after Thaddeus had ridden home drunk from a card game in Bitter Fork. By the time the neighbors arrived with buckets, the barn was a pillar of flame, and the house was catching, and Thaddeus, trying to drag a strong box from the smoke, was found at dawn beneath a fallen rafter. Adeline survived because she had been sleeping on the porch that night, having locked herself out her own bedroom one too many times and given up on going back in. She lost the house, the barn, the horses, and the husband, and she gained a widow's veil and a pile of debts in a town that, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, began to look at her as though the fire had been somehow her doing. Thaddeus's older brother, Cyrus Voss, rode in from Cheyenne for the funeral, took one cold look at her across the open grave, and made it his business from that day forward to ensure that the name Voss in Stillwater Bend belonged to him alone. So she had moved into a one-room cottage at the prairie's edge, on a small piece of land that had been her own before the marriage, and there she had stitched her veil and pulled it down over her face. And there she had lived for 3 years and 4 months, a graceful, slender shape in black, who came to Mercantile only when she had to, who sat in the last pew at church and slipped out before the final hymn, who spoke to almost no one and was almost never spoken to except in whispers that traveled just slightly too loud. The veil had become her wall, and behind it she had grown so quiet that some morning she had to touch her own throat to remember she still had a voice at all. A man's history rides into a town long before he does, and Rafe McAllister's history was the kind that traveled quiet, the way good men's histories tend to. He came up the old cattle trace from the high country of Wyoming on the second Tuesday of October, 1879, driving 400 head of red and white longhorns toward winter pasture along the Bittersweet River. And the first thing folks in Stillwater Bend noticed about him was not his height, though he stood a clean 6'3" in his stockings, and not the breadth of his shoulders, though they had been built by 10 years of rope and saddle, but the way he tipped his hat to every woman he passed, young or old, plain or pretty, as though courtesy were a coin he could not stop spending. He was 32 years old, with sun-dark skin and steady gray eyes and a jaw that had been broken once and set crooked enough to keep him from being too handsome for his own good. He wore a long oilskin dust of the color wet sage and a battered Stetson that had ridden through 2 blizzards and a flood. And when he spoke, which was not often, his voice came out low and unhurried, the kind of voice that makes horses settle and dogs stop barking, and tired women stop apologizing for taking up space. He had been born on a hardscrabble farm in the Ozarks, lost his mother to childbirth fever when he was 9, and lost his father to a lumber accident when he was 14, and he had spent the long years between then. And now, learning that the world is mostly weather, you cannot argue with it. You can only ride through it with your hat pulled low. He had loved a girl once, a schoolteacher named Mary in a copper mining town in Colorado, and he had been engaged to her for one short summer before consumption took her in a single hard winter. And after he buried her, he had taken to the trail and stayed there because grief, he had discovered, does not chase a man as fast when the man keeps moving. 8 years he had drifted, taking on cattle drives and breaking horses for honest pay, sleeping under more stars and roofs. And somewhere along the way he had stopped believing he would settle anywhere again, and started believing instead that his job in this life was simply to be useful, to mend what fences he could mend, to lift what loads he could lift, and to leave each town a little gentler than he had found it. He came into Stillwater Bend on that Tuesday afternoon with his trail boss, a grizzled old hand named Whitcomb Pell, and the two of them put up at the Cottonwood Hotel and walked across the dusty Main Street to Hennessy's Mercantile to lay in flour and coffee and a few sacks of feed. The Mercantile sat on the corner of Main and Spruce, with a long pine porch and a hitching rail worn smooth by 20 years of horses. And as Rafe came up the steps with Whitcomb at his elbow, he heard the kind of laughter a man learns to listen for, the laughter that has no joy in it, the laughter that is really a knife wearing a smile. There at the far end of the porch, 3 men in good wool coats had cornered a woman in black against the railing. She held a small woven basket against her hip, and her face was hidden beneath a long mourning veil, so dark it seemed to drink the sunlight. And even from 20 feet away, Rafe could see how her shoulders were drawn in, how her gloved hands had gone perfectly still on the basket handle. the way a deer goes still when it knows it cannot outrun what is coming. The tallest of the three, a heavy-jowled man with silver at his temples and a gold watch chain across a green silk vest, was speaking down at her in a slow, sweet voice some men use when they want their cruelty to sound like concern. "Now, Adeline, sister-in-law of mine," he was saying, loud enough for the whole porch to hear, "folks have been mighty patient with your little theatrics. But 3.5 years is a long time to play the grieving dove, and a woman with debts like yours don't get to wear black forever. My brother's name deserves better than a widow who can't keep a roof over her head. You think on what I offered you here? My door is always open." The two younger men, both broad-shouldered and grinning, laughed at this in that practiced way hired men laugh at a boss's joke, and the woman in black said nothing and made no move, only stood there with her basket, and the silence inside her veil felt to Rafe like a hell breath that had been held for years. He had not yet learned her name, had not yet seen her face, had not yet heard her voice, but something in his chest, the same quiet something that always told him when a fence was about to give or a horse was about to bolt, told him plain as daylight that this was not a thing a decent man walked past. He stepped onto the porch, set down his saddlebags with a soft thump that turned every head, and tipped his hat, first to the lady in black, slow and respectful, and then, almost as an afterthought, to the three men by the railing. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," he said in that low, unhurried voice of his. "Looks to me like the lady was here first, and she's got shopping to finish. Reckon her business with the mercantile comes ahead of her business with you." Cyrus Voss turned, and his eyes, small, pale, and quick, measured Ray from boots to crown and found, to his evident displeasure, that the stranger was a head taller than himself, and not the kind of man who measured back. Cyrus opened his mouth, then closed it, then forced a thin smile, the way a banker smiles at a customer he intends to ruin later. "Family matter, friend," he said softly. "No concern of yours." "No, sir," Rafe agreed just as softly. "It surely ain't. But the porch is public, and the lady looks tired. And I find I'm a man who'd take it personal if she had to stand any longer." He held the door of the mercantile open with one long arm, looked past Cyrus entirely, and spoke for the first time directly to her. "Ma'am, after you." Beneath the veil, Adeline Voss did not move for the space of one heartbeat, and then another, as though she could not quite believe a door had been opened for her by a stranger in this town. And then, with a small, careful nod, she stepped past Cyrus and his men and through the doorway, and as she crossed the threshold, the hem of her black skirt brushed Rafe's boot, and the lightness of it surprised him. She weighed almost nothing at all, he thought, like a bird that had forgotten how to land. He did not see her face that day. He only saw the straight line of her back disappearing into the cool, flower-scented dark of Hennessy's, and he heard, behind him, Cyrus Voss mutter something about drifters minding their own affairs, and Rafe McAllister, who had ridden into Stillwater Bend that morning, meaning only to winter his cattle and move on by spring, understood with quiet certainty that his plans had just changed. The bittersweet river got its name from a French trapper who had come to the country 100 years before anyone built a town near it, and he had called it that because the water tasted clean and cold on the tongue, but carried, in the spring, the faint tannin of cottonwood bark that made the back of the throat ache a little, the way a sweet memory aches when it sits too long in a man's mouth. The river ran wide and shallow along the eastern edge of Stillwater Bend, fringed by pale grasses and stands of yellow cottonwood, and it was on the gravel bar at the river's most quiet bend, where the current slowed to a glassy hush, that Rafe McAllister rode out alone on the morning after he had opened the door for a woman in black. He had not slept well, which was unusual for him. He had lain awake on the narrow bed at the Cottonwood Hotel, listening to the sounds of the town settling in around him, the last lamps going out at the saloon, a dog barking 3 streets over, the soft clop of the night marshal's horse, and he had found himself thinking, against his own habit, about a pair of gloved hands gone still on a basket handle. He rose before first light, saddled his roan gelding, Pilot, and rode east out of town simply because east was where the river was, and the river was where a man could think. And a man who was thinking too much about a stranger had business, sorting himself out before breakfast. The sun had not yet cleared the low hills when he came down the gravel slope to the bend, and the mist was still rising off the water in slow white ribbons. And there in the middle of that cold autumn current stood a woman in black, knee-deep, perfectly still, her mourning veil trailing on the surface like spilled ink that refused to dissolve. Her boots and stockings sat neatly on the gravel bank, set side by side as though she meant to come back for them, and a small basket of river-washed stones sat beside the boots, the kind of stones a child might gather to weight a hem or a heart. Her face was turned away from him, toward the far shore, and her arms hung loose at her sides, and she did not seem to feel the cold at all. Rafe drew Pilot to a halt 15 yards off and sat very still, because there are moments a man rides up on in this country, a doe drinking, a sunrise hitting a ridge, a soul standing in deep water, that a wise man does not interrupt with sudden noise. He took off his hat and held it across his saddle horn, and he watched her, not the way a man watches a woman, but the way a man watches a wounded bird. He is trying to decide whether to help or leave be. After a long while she tilted her head down toward the dark water, moving past her knees, and he heard her speak, soft, almost not aloud, the way a person speaks to someone who has been gone a long time. "I don't know how," she said. "I don't know how to come out." The wind took the words and almost lost them, but Rafe heard them, and something in his chest, the part that had been quiet for 8 long years, since a girl named Mary, turned over once like a sleeping animal waking up. He swung down from Pilot, looped the reins over a willow branch, and walked along the gravel bar slow and easy, his boots crunching just loud enough that she would hear him coming and not be startled. "Ma'am," he said when he was still a respectful distance from the water, "didn't mean to disturb your morning. Saw your basket from the rise, and thought maybe a body had taken a fall. Glad to see her standing." She did not turn at first. She lifted one gloved hand and touched the edge of her veil where it lay on the water, and the river pulled at it gently, the way a child tugs a sleeve. "I'm not standing, sir," she said, and her voice, low and clear and trembling at the seams, was the voice he had not heard the day before on the mercantile porch. "I'm only forgetting how to fall." He weighed those words a long moment, and he understood them better than she could have known. He set his hat back on his head, and then, because the gravel under his own feet was cold even through his boots, and she had been in that water Lord knew how long, he sat himself down on a flat river stone at the edge of the bank, easy as a man settling at a friend's hearth, and he spoke without looking directly at her, the way a person speaks to a horse that has not yet decided to trust him. "Reckon I've stood in a few cold rivers myself, ma'am," he said. "Not this one. There was a creek in Colorado, thawed too early one March, and I waded out in it after a calf that didn't need saving. I just didn't want to go back to the bunkhouse, on account of I had buried somebody 3 days before, and the bunkhouse had her shawl still on the peg. I stood in that creek till my legs went numb, thinking the cold might wash the hurt out of me. It didn't, but you know what did finally help, ma'am, after a long time of trying every wrong thing?" She did not answer, but the angle of her head shifted just slightly toward the bank. "A neighbor," he said, "an old woman with hands like saddle leather. She came out to that creek after me, didn't say one word about my carrying on, just stood on the bank and waited. And when I came out of the water on my own, she handed me a dry blanket and walked me home and sat me down and made me a cup of coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. And she said, 'Son, grief is a country, and you're allowed to live there a while, but you ain't allowed to die there, not on my watch.' I never forgot her. Ma'am, I reckon I'm her this morning, if you'd allow it." The river moved between them, dark and slow, and he heard her breath catch, a small, broken sound, like a stitch giving way, and then, very slowly, she turned her veiled face toward him at last. "My name is Adeline Voss," she said, "and I have been dying in this country for 3 years and 4 months, sir, and I do not believe anyone has been keeping watch." "Rafe McAllister, ma'am," he said gently, "and I reckon somebody has been. He's just been a slow rider." She laughed. Or rather, a single small sound came out of her that might have been the ghost of a laugh. The first one her throat had attempted in a very long time, and the surprise of it made her sway a little where she stood. Rafe rose then, slow and steady, and walked to the very edge of the river, and he held out one long, sun-brown hand, palm up in the air between them. "Miss Adeline," he said, "your mourning veil is heavier than iron, and you have carried it a long way. I won't ask you to set it down today, but I'd be obliged if you'd let me untie it from your hair and let the water take it off your shoulders for a while, just for the space of one sunrise, so I can see you're real and not a sorrow somebody dreamed up." For a long time she did not move. The water moved, and the mist moved, and a single yellow cottonwood leaf came down from a branch and rode the current past her hip and out of sight. And Rafe McAllister kept his hand exactly where it was, neither lifting nor lowering it, the way a man holds a feed bucket out to a wild horse and waits. Then, soft as a breath, Adeline Voss waded toward him through the cold water, and she stopped just short of his outstretched hand, and she bent her head down low, the way a child bends to be kissed good night, offering him the ribbons of her veil. He did not touch her face. He did not touch her hair. He only reached, with hands that had gentled wild horses and cradled newborn calves, to the small black silk not at the nape of her neck, and with a patience she had not been shown by any soul in years, he loosened it. The veil came free in one long wisp of cloth. He drew it slowly forward over the crown of her head and out into the open air, and for the briefest heartbeat he held it suspended above the river, a long ribbon of darkness shivering in the dawn light. And then he opened his fingers and he let it go. The bittersweet river took it the way a river takes everything, without hurry, without judgment, without giving it back. The veil drifted out into the current, spread like a black water lily for one slow turn, and then folded under and was gone downstream around the bend. And the silence that followed it was the deepest silence Adeline Voss had ever stood inside in her entire life. She lifted her face. The sun cleared the ridge in that exact moment, the way the sun sometimes does for people who have been waiting a great while in the dark. And a long beam of pale gold light came down to the cottonwood branches and fell across her, across cheekbones too fine for a woman who had been forgetting to eat, across a mouth that had not been smiled at in a long time, across eyes the color of wet river stone, gray-green and wide and brimming, set in a face so quietly, sorrowfully beautiful that Rafe McAllister, who had ridden in 12 states and seen most of what God had bothered to make pretty in this country, had to take off his hat again, simply because his manners would not let him keep it on. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was not quite as steady as he meant it to be. "Good morning." Her lips parted. Tears stood in her eyes but did not fall, and she did not wipe them away, because for the first time in 3 years and 4 months there was no veil to push aside. "Good morning, Mr. McAllister," she whispered. He held out his hand again, and this time she put her cold, slender, gloved fingers into his palm, and he walked her up out of the river one careful step at a time, and he set her down on the flat river stone where he had been sitting, and he took off his oilskin duster and laid it around her shoulders without a word, and he knelt and put her boots back onto her, wet feet the way a father puts shoes on a child. And never once did his eyes leave her face longer than was decent, because he understood, as surely as he understood anything in this life, that he had just witnessed a woman come up out of a grave. Autumn in Montana territory does not come the way it comes in softer country. It does not tiptoe in with a few yellow leaves and a cool evening. It arrives all at once, on a hard north wind that smells of cedar smoke and far-off snow. And it tells every living thing on the high plains that the time for hiding has come to an end and the time for getting one's house in order has begun. It was on the morning after the river, a clear, Sharp morning with a sky the color of washed denim, that Rafe McAllister rode out to 3 miles east of Stillwater Bend, down a wagon track gone weedy with neglect, and turned in at a leaning gate post where a small frame cottage sat alone on a low rise of prairie grass, with a sagging porch and chimney that wanted repointing and a chicken coop missing half its slats. He had asked Whitcomb Pell, his trail boss, the night before whether a hand could be spared from the herd for a piece of the morning, and Whitcomb, who had known Ray for 6 years and could read him the way a preacher reads a Bible, had only spit a long stream of tobacco juice into the dust and said, "Take whatever you need. Son, the cattle ain't going nowhere, and you've been wearing a face I ain't seen on you since before that schoolteacher passed." Rafe had not answered him, but he had not denied it either, which was answer enough. Adeline Voss came out onto her porch that morning with a chipped enamel cup of coffee in her hand, and stopped dead at the sight of a tall man, on a roan horse, swinging down at her gate. She had not put on her veil. She had taken a new one out of the cedar chest at first light. A fresh black square of silk her sister-in-law back in Kentucky had sent her 2 Christmases ago, and she had laid it across her lap and looked at it for a long time, and she had folded it back into the chest. Her hair, the color of late wheat that had never fully gone away even under 3 years of mourning, was pinned up loose at the back of her neck, and a few strands had come down already in the morning wind, and she was, in her plain gray work dress, more beautiful than she had any idea of being. "Mr. McAllister," she said, and her voice had a tremor in it she had not yet learned how to hide. I did not expect a caller." "Didn't come as a caller, ma'am," he answered, taking off his hat and holding it against his chest the way he always did when speaking to her. "Came as a neighbor. Saw your fences yesterday from the river road. South line's down in 3 places. And your coop won't keep a fox out longer than it takes him to think about it. Reckon I owe a debt to whoever taught me to mend. And I aim to pay it on your post today, if you'll allow." She stood there in the doorway, her small hand tied around the cup, and he watched the question move across her face. The old question, the one she had been asked silently by every kindness in her life, since Thaddeus Voss. The question of what does this man want from me in exchange? And he watched her decide, slowly, that perhaps not every man in this world charged for his help. She stepped aside from her doorway and said very quietly, "I have nothing to pay you with, Mr. McAllister." "Didn't ask for nothing, Miss Adeline," he said. "But I won't lie to you. I'd take a cup of that coffee, if there's a second one in the pot." There was. She poured it with hands that shook only a little, and she handed it to him on the porch steps, and he sat down on the top step with his long legs stretched out and drank it slow while she stood above him at the porch rail, and neither of them spoke for a while, because there are silences that are awkward and there are silences that are simply the sound of 2 people learning the shape of each other's quiet, and this was the second kind. He worked her south fence line that day from mid-morning until past noon, stripped down to his shirt sleeves in the cold sun, swinging a maul she had not seen swung in years, sinking new locust posts in the ground that fought him every inch. She watched him from the kitchen window for the first hour, half hidden behind the curtain like a girl, and then she grew ashamed of her own hiding and went out with a tin pail of biscuits and a fresh pot of coffee and set them on a stump near where he was working. And she said, awkward as a sparrow, "You'll want something at noon, sir." He thanked her and ate 2 biscuits and drank the coffee and said they were the finest biscuits he had eaten west of the Mississippi, and she went back inside with her cheeks burning because no one had complimented anything she had made in longer than she cared to count. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He did not ask permission, and he did not announce himself. He simply rode up at first light, tipped his hat to her on the porch, and started in on whatever was next. The chicken coop on the second day, the woodpile on the third, the broken pump handle on the fourth. Whitcomb Pell sent 2 of the younger drovers, a freckled boy named Sully and a quiet half-crow tracker named Joseph 2 Rivers, to ride for the herd in the afternoons, and word began to travel through Stillwater Bend, the way word always traveled, that the tall stranger who had wintered his cattle on the Bittersweet was spending an unusual amount of his daylight on the widow Voss's place. Some folks, mostly the older women who'd been quietly aching about Adeline for years, smiled small private smiles into their wash water. Other folks, and Cyrus Voss was one of them, set their jaws and waited. Inside the cottage, a slower, smaller change was happening. Adeline began, without quite meaning to cook again. She had eaten for 3 years out of a single tin plate, mostly cornbread and beans, mostly cold. Now she found herself rolling out biscuit dough at 4 a.m, simmering pots of chicken and dumplings, baking a dried apple pie on a Friday because she remembered her mother's recipe and had not made one since the year Eliza May was born. She told herself it was only because a working man needed to eat, and then she stopped telling herself anything at all, because the truth was that the smell of coffee and bread in her kitchen in the morning had begun to make the cottage feel, after a long emptiness, like a house where somebody lived. He never came inside. He sat on the porch step and ate from a plate she handed him through the door, and he washed his own tin in the rain barrel. And at sundown he tipped his hat and rode back to the herd. And not once in the first 2 weeks did his hand brush hers when she passed him a cup. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. Neither of them said a word about it, because they were both, in their separate ways, people who understood that some fires need to be built one small twig at a time, or the wind will blow them out. It was on a Sunday afternoon, the 3rd Sunday after the river, that he asked her if she would care to walk down to the cottonwoods along the creek that fed the Bittersweet, on account of the cranes were passing through, and a body ought not miss them. She put on a shawl the color of fresh cream, a shawl she had not worn since before the fire, that she had found at the bottom of the cedar chest, and had wept over for a quarter of an hour before pinning it on, and she walked beside him down the slope of yellow grass, her thin hands folded in front of her, and they stood at the creek bank for almost an hour watching the great gray birds come down out of the north in long ragged ribbons, hundreds of them at a time, calling that ancient lonesome call that has been the sound of autumn on the high plains since before any white man's boot ever touched the country. My grandmother, Adeline said, almost to the wind, used to say cranes carry the souls of women who never got to finish their songs. Rafe was quiet a long while, watching the birds, and then he said, "Then I reckon there's a good number of those songs still out there, ma'am, and a good number of women still down here got time yet to finish theirs." She did not answer him, but when they walked back up the slope, she walked half a step closer to him than she had walked on the way down. And when a stone turned under her boot and she stumbled, his hand caught her elbow, the first time his bare hand had ever touched any part of her, and he steadied her, and he let go the instant she was steady again, and neither of them spoke of it. But that night, alone in her cottage with the lamp turned down low, Adeline Voss laid her palm on the inside of her own elbow where his hand had been, and she found that the place was still warm, and she sat there for a long time with her own hand cupped over that warmth, the way a person cups a candle flame against the wind. The first hard snow of that year came down on the 17th of November, a fine dry powder out of the north that hissed against the windows like a whispered secret, and laid 2 inches of clean white over the prairie before sundown. And after that the country settled into that strange, hushed, candle-lit quality that only the high plains know in early winter, when the world goes small, and the stove becomes the center of every house, and every conversation slows down to the pace of a kettle coming to boil. Rafe McAllister was now riding out from the line camp his men had thrown up along the Bittersweet, not from the hotel, and his daily route had taken on a shape. Sunrise with a herd, mid-morning at the widow's place, afternoon back among the cattle, supper light at her porch, and home through the dark to a bedroll under canvas. Whitcombell, watching him ride out one cold morning with a parcel of dried apples tucked inside his coat, had only shaken his head and said to Joseph Two Rivers, "That boy is wintering more than cattle this year," and Joseph, who said almost nothing about almost anything, had answered, "About time," and gone back to his coffee. It was on the first true blizzard night of the season, a long howling night in late November when, The wind came off the Rockies like a thing with teeth. That Rafe stayed inside the cottage for the first time. He had ridden through worsening weather to bring her a sack of cornmeal and 2 thick wool blankets from town. And by the time he reached her gate, the snow was sideways, and Pilot was breathing white plumes, and there was no sense at all, in turning that horse back into the storm. Adeline opened the door before he could knock, and her face, bare, no veil, hair half down from the wind that had come in past her open shutter, was tight with worry that she was clearly trying not to show. "You will stable that horse, Mr. McAllister," she said, in a voice firmer than he'd yet heard from her. "And you will come inside this house, and you will not argue with me about it, because I will not have a man freeze to death at my gate to spare my reputation, when my reputation, sir, has not been worth a thimble of ditch water for 3.5 years. He laughed, a short, surprised, real laugh, and he did as she said. He saw the Pilot in the small lean-to behind the cottage, rubbed the gelding down with sacking, threw the blankets over him, and forked out the last of her hay. Then he came in through her kitchen door, stamping snow off his boots, and Adeline Voss closed her door behind him on a Montana blizzard and locked it. And for the first time in 3 years and 4 months, a man other than a stove repairman or a tax collector stood inside her one-room house. She had stew on the stove. She had made it for herself, a small pot of venison and onions and dried turnips. And she ladled out 2 bowls without asking and set them on the small pine table by the window. And they ate by the yellow light of a single kerosene lamp while the wind took the cottage in both hands and shook it. They did not speak much during the eating. Afterward, she poured coffee into the 2 enamel cups, and she set a tin of molasses cookies between them. And she went to the cedar chest in the corner and lifted the lid. Rafe watched, unmoving, as she took something small and folded out the bottom, and brought it back to the table, a little white linen baby cap, no bigger than his closed fist, edged in pale blue thread, soft from being held by hands that had held it 1,000 times. Her name was Eliza May, Adeline said, and she sat down across from him and laid the cap on the wood between them, and she folded her thin hands in her lap as carefully as a woman folds a letter she has waited her whole life to read. She was 7 months and 11 days old. The fever took her in the autumn of '75. I have never told the story of her to any soul in this town, Mr. McAllister, because the moment I tell it, she becomes real to somebody else, and then somebody else has the right to forget her, and I cannot bear that any one more person should forget her. Rafe did not reach for the cap. He did not reach for her hand. He set down his coffee cup very softly, and he leaned his forearms on the table, and he looked at her across the small yellow circle of lamplight, and he said, "Then tell me, Miss Adeline, I will not forget her. You have my word, and I have never broke it." She told him then. She told him about Cedar Hollow, and her mother's poetry, and the dogwoods in April. She told him about Thaddeus Voss, and the silver-trimmed saddle, and the slow private cruelties no one had ever seen. She told him about the snowy February morning Eliza May was born, and the 7 months of pure light that had followed, and about the fever, and about the small pine box, and about the cottonwood she could see from her kitchen window where her daughter slept under 3 years of grass. She told him about the fire and the strong box and the rafter, and the husband she had not been able to mourn the way a widow was supposed to, because mourning was a clean grief, and what she had carried from that marriage was not clean. It was a black, complicated, ashamed thing, and the veil she had worn ever since had not been for Thaddeus at all. She said, almost in a whisper, the veil had been for Eliza May. The veil had been the only mourning she had been allowed to wear in a town that did not let women grieve their daughters as loud as they grieve their husbands. She wept then, for the first time in front of him, and she did not weep prettily. She wept the way a person weeps when a wound has been packed too long, hard and ragged and without grace. Rafe McAllister got up from his chair, slow as a sunrise, and he came around the small pine table, and he knelt down on the cottage floor beside her chair, the way a man kneels an altar, and he did not pull her into his arms. He only laid one large, sun-browned, work-roughened hand flat on the table beside her folded ones, palm up, and he left it there, as steady as a porch rail, as patient as a man holding out a hand to a half-tamed deer. After a long time, her hand came down off her lap and slid into his, and he closed his fingers around hers as carefully as a man closes a pocket watch he has been trusted to carry. "Miss Adeline," he said low and rough, "your husband did not deserve you, and your town did not deserve you, and your sorrow has been a holy thing. And I do not know yet what kind of man I am to you, but I know I am not a man who is going anywhere. Not this winter. Not next spring. Not until you tell me plain to my face to ride." She did not tell him to ride. She held on to his hand, and the storm went on outside, and the lamp burned low, and after a while she rose and made up a bedroll for him on the rag rug in front of the stove, and she went behind the calico curtain to her own narrow bed, and they slept that night under one roof for the first time, and nothing happened between them that a preacher could not have witnessed. And yet everything happened because trust, Rafe had long ago learned, is the first true intimacy, and every other intimacy a decent man earns is built on top of it like a house on a stone foundation. The blizzard blew itself out by Wednesday. Rafe rode back to the line camp on Thursday morning with Adeline standing on the porch wrapped in his oilskin coat, her cheeks pink with cold and something else, and that should have been the start of a long, slow, shining winter for them both. It would have been, except that Cyrus Voss, who had spent the whole storm sitting in the back room of the Pinewood saloon with a half-empty bottle of rye and a head full of poison, came out of that storm with a folded paper in his coat and a hired man on either elbow, and he rode out to the cottage on the prairie's edge on the very next Sunday afternoon, while Rafe was still 3 miles off with the herd. Adeline heard the horses first. 3 horses, coming slow, the way men come who are sure of themselves. She stepped out onto the porch in her gray dress with no veil, and she watched her dead husband's brother dismount at her gate with that same green silk vest under a heavy coat, and her hands began to tremble, and then, and this surprised her most of all, they stopped. Cyrus walked up onto her porch without removing his hat, and he held out the folded paper, and he smiled the slow smile she had known and feared for 3.5 years. "Sister Adeline," he said gently, "I have been more patient with you than any man in this territory would have been, but I have here a deed of transfer, signed by my late brother 3 weeks before he passed, granting this parcel of land and the cottage on it to me in settlement of certain debts of his that I have personally satisfied. The judge in Bitter Fork has stamped it. You have until the 1st of December to vacate. I am told you have grown fond of a certain drover, and I am sure he will be glad to take you up behind him on his horse when he rides on in the spring. They always do, Adeline. They always ride on." He laid the paper in her hand. He tipped his hat. He mounted up and rode away with his 2 men. And Adeline Voss stood on her porch in the cold afternoon sun, with a forged deed in her trembling fingers and the whole shaky house of her new hope leaning sideways under the weight of it. And she did not weep. For the first time in her life, when a Voss man handed her a cruelty, she did not weep. She walked back inside, and she set the paper on the pine table, and she took a stub of pencil from the drawer, and on the back of one of her own old letters she wrote 4 words in a hand that surprised her with its steadiness. "Rafe, come at sundown." She gave a note to a passing field hand bound for the river road with a copper coin, and then she sat down by her coal stove, and she waited, and as the long blue prairie evening came down, she discovered a thing about herself that 3 years and 4 months of veil had hidden even from her own eyes. She discovered that somewhere underneath the widow, underneath the wife, underneath the silent woman who had walked the back pews and slipped out before the final hymn, there was still a girl named Adeline Whitfield from Cedar Hollow, whose father had said her laugh could coax a cardinal off a fence post. And that girl, it turned out, was not finished yet. Rafe came at sundown the way he had come every day for 40 days. He read the deed by the last of the kitchen light. He read it twice. He folded it in half and laid it on the table, and he looked across at Adeline, and he said very quietly, "This paper is a lie, Miss Adeline, and we are going to prove it, but I will not lie to you neither. Cyrus Voss is not a man who walks away from a thing once he has set his hand to it, and the road from here to the courthouse is going to be hard. And I need to know one thing from you before I ride for Bitter Fork at first light." "What thing, Mr. McAllister?" she whispered. "I need to know," he said, "that you will not go back behind the veil while I am gone. Not for 1 hour. Not for 1 minute. The world has tried to make you small your whole life, Miss Adeline, and I have ridden a long way to find you standing up in a river, and I will not come back to find you sat down again." She looked at him a long, long time across the small pine table. The lamp threw their shadows huge against the cottage wall. Two tall, joined shapes leaning toward each other. And outside the first owl of the evening called once across the prairie. "I will not sit down, Rafe," she said. And it was the first time she had ever said his given name aloud. And the sound of it in her own voice made her hand fly up to her mouth, as though she had let loose a wild bird from her chest. And Rafe McAllister, watching her across the lamplight, knew that whatever came in the morning, whatever Cyrus Voss had brought down on them, the woman in front of him was not the woman who had stood in the river 40 days before. The woman in front of him was alive. Rafe rode out of Stillwater Bend before the stars had finished going pale, with Joseph Two Rivers riding silent beside him, and a leather satchel of folded papers strapped behind his saddle. And the 40-mile road to the territorial seat at Bitter Fork lay before them under a thin skin of new snow that crunched beneath the horse's hooves like sugar under a spoon. He had not slept. He had spent the long hours after he left Adeline's porch sitting at the small writing desk in the line camp tent, going through the worn leather wallet that had belonged to his late father, a wallet that had carried, for 18 years, a single yellowed envelope Rafe had almost forgotten he kept there. Inside the envelope was a letter, dated August of 1874, written in a careful hand by a Kansas City attorney named Bartholomew Reed, addressed to Rafe's father, asking for character references on one Thaddeus Voss, who had applied for a substantial loan against future cattle profits, and listing among Mr. Voss's known associates a brother named Cyrus Voss of Cheyenne, who had himself been the subject of 2 prior fraud complaints in the state of Nebraska. Rafe's father, a quiet, honest man who had broker horses for half the country between St. Louis and Denver, had answered that letter. Rafe could remember him sitting at the kitchen table writing it, and had kept a copy of his reply. And that copy was in the envelope, too, neatly folded in his father's hand. It said, in essence, that he would not vouch for Thaddeus Voss, on account of the company he kept and the brother he traveled with, and that Mr. Reed would be wise to look very carefully at any document either Voss put before him. It was a small letter. It would not by itself undo a forged deed, but it was a thread, and Rafe McAllister had learned in his 32 years that an honest thread, pulled hard enough by an honest hand, can unravel a great deal of dishonest cloth. They reached Bitter Fork at the second sundown, found the office of Bartholomew Reed still open above the territorial bank, and the old attorney, gray as a winter sparrow now, but sharp behind his spectacles, read his own 18-year-old letter twice, looked up and said, "Mr. McAllister, I have been waiting for somebody to walk through that door about Cyrus Voss for a very long time. Sit down, son. We have work to do." They worked through the night. Mr. Reed sent a telegram to a clerk he knew in Cheyenne. He sent another to a county recorder in Nebraska. He pulled from a locked cabinet of old correspondence 3 further letters in which Cyrus Voss had been mentioned in connection with disputed land transfers in 2 states. By the time the morning train whistled into Bitter Fork on Tuesday, they had assembled a thin but steady weight of paper, and Mr. Reed had filed an emergency motion before Judge Hollis Carmichael of the Territorial Court, requesting that Cyrus Voss's deed of transfer be examined for forgery before any eviction could be enforced. The hearing was set for Friday morning. Rafe sent word ahead by rider to Adeline at the cottage, "Court Friday. Hold steady." I am coming home Thursday night. And he and Joseph turned their horses back toward Stillwater Bend in a hard coal rain that turned the road to Black Ribbon by sundown. But Cyrus Voss had eyes in Bitter Fork, and word reached him the motion and the lawyer and the 18-year-old letter from a dead man in the Ozarks. And Cyrus Voss was not a man who waited for a Friday court when a Thursday night could be made to do his work for him. On Thursday afternoon, while Rafe was still 10 miles out on the rain-slicked road, Cyrus rode up to Adeline's cottage with his 2 hired men and a 5-gallon can of kerosene, because of a piece of land had no cottage standing on it. Then the question of whose cottage it became a great deal smaller question, and a widow with no roof was a widow easily moved. Adeline saw them coming up the wagon track. From her kitchen window, she saw the can. She saw the way Cyrus dismounted and handed it to the taller of his men, and she understood, in the cold, clean way a person understands the weather, exactly what was about to happen to the only walls she had left in this world. And the old Adeline, the veiled Adeline, would have stood very still inside those walls and let them burn down around her, because that Adeline had learned long ago that resistance only made cruel men crueler. But the woman who had said, "I will not sit down," Rafe into a lamplit kitchen 4 nights before was a different woman, and she did something her veiled self would never have done. She walked out onto her porch in her gray dress with no shawl and no veil, and she stood at the top of her steps with her thin hands quiet at her sides. And when Cyrus Voss looked up at her with his can-bearing man behind him, she spoke first in a voice that carried clear across the yard. "Cyrus Voss," she said, "you will set that can down on my ground, and you will turn your horses, and you will ride off this place, because you and I both know what that paper of yours is, and you and I both know what your brother was, and I am done, sir, I am done, being quiet about either one." Cyrus laughed. He took the can from his man and walked a few steps closer to the porch, and he tipped it slightly so that the smell of kerosene ran out into the cold air between them. "Sister Adeline," he said, "you have found yourself a tongue at last. A pity it took you 4 years and a drover to find it, and a pity neither will be here by morning to hear you use it. You are wrong about both, Mr. Voss." The voice came from behind Cyrus, low and steady, and not raised at all. And Cyrus Voss turned slowly with the can in his hand and saw Rafe McAllister sitting his roan gelding at the gate, rain dripping off the brim of his Stetson, and behind Rafe, Joseph 2 Rivers on a paint pony. And behind Joseph, 3 more riders, Whitcomb Pell on his big bay, the freckled boy Sully on a chestnut, and, most surprising of all, the sheriff of Stillwater Bend, a thick-shouldered man named Elias Hammond, on a gray mare, with a star pin playing on the outside of his slicker. Rafe swung down. He did not draw his sidearm, and he did not raise his voice. He walked across the yard slow and easy, and he stopped 6 feet from Cyrus Voss, and he held out his open hand. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you're able to give me that can, and then Sheriff Hammond here is going to ride you and your 2 men back into Stillwater Bend. And tomorrow morning at the hearing in Bitter Fork that you are now going to attend, Mr. Bartholomew Reed is going to lay before Judge Carmichael a stack of paper that goes back 18 years and 3 states. And the deed in your saddlebag is going to be examined by an honest hand. And after that, sir, you and I will have no further dealings, because you will be a guest of the territorial court for a good while. Now, the can, Mr. Voss, the lady has waited long enough." Cyrus Voss looked at Rafe a long moment. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the 4 other riders fanned out behind. He looked, last, up at Adeline Voss on her porch, at the woman who was not, after all, going to burn quietly with her cottage, and something in his face went small and ugly and finally tired, the way a bully's face goes tired when the bullying has stopped working. He set the can down on the wet ground. His hired men, neither of whom had been paid enough for what was now happening, took their hands very carefully off their saddle pommels. Sheriff Hammond rode his gray forward and tipped his hat to Adeline. "Ma'am," he said, "I should have come out here a long time before now. I am ashamed I did not. That is between me and my conscience, and I will live with it. But I am here this evening, and I will be at the courthouse in the morning, and I will see this thing through." He turned his horse, jerked his head at the Voss men, and the three of them rode off down the wagon track in the cold rain with the sheriff and Wickham and Sully at their heels. The hearing at Bitter Fork the next morning lasted 3 hours. Mr. Bartholomew Reed laid out his papers. The county recorder from Nebraska, who had ridden in by the morning train, identified Cyrus Voss's signature on 2 prior fraudulent transfers. Judge Hollis Carmichael, a man with a long gray beard and longer patience for rascals, examined the deed Cyrus had pressed into Adeline's hand, compared the signature on it to 3 confirmed signatures of the late Thaddeus Voss kept on file at the Territorial Bank, and pronounced, in a voice dry as a closed Bible, that the deed was a forgery so amateurish it was almost an insult to the court. Cyrus Voss was bound over for trial on charges of forgery, attempted arson, and intimidation of a widow, and he was led from the courtroom in irons. And he did not look up once at the woman in the gray dress who sat in the front row with her thin hands folded in her lap, and her weak-colored hair pinned plain and no veil at all, on her quiet, beautiful face. When Judge Carmichael had banged his gavel and the courtroom had begun to empty, Adeline Voss rose from her bench and walked out into the November sunlight on the courthouse steps. And Rafe McAllister was waiting for her there with his hat in his hand, and she stopped in front of him on the top step, and for the first time she lifted her own hand and laid it flat against the lapel of his coat, over his heart, the way a person checks that something is real. "Mr. McAllister," she said, "I would like, if you would permit it, to ride home today on the same horse as you. I am tired, sir, of riding alone." Rafe McAllister, who had not cried in 8 years, found that his eyes had gone unaccountably blurred, and he simply nodded because his voice was for the moment unavailable to him. And he handed her up onto Pilot's back behind the cantle and swung up in front of her, and her thin arms came around his middle and held on as if she had been waiting her whole life for something solid to hold on to. They rode the long road back to Stillwater Bend that afternoon under a sky scrubbed clean by the rain, and somewhere behind them a winter crane called once across the open country, and Adeline Voss tipped her bare head back and listened to it all the way home. Spring came late that year to Montana Territory, the way spring often does in country that has been hard used by a long winter. But when it came in earnest, first in the small green needles of new grass along the south slopes, then in the sudden mad chorus of meadowlarks at dawn, then in the white drifts of plum blossom along the bittersweet river, until one morning in the last week of April the whole prairie around Stillwater Bend smelled of wet earth and crushed sage and something else, something harder to name, that an old preacher might have called forgiveness, and a young girl might simply have called beginning again. Adeline Whitfield Voss walked out onto her porch on the first warm Sunday of May in a dress the color of fresh cream, the same shawl she had worn to see the cranes, and a small wreath of prairie violets pinned in her wheat-colored hair, and Rafe McAllister, standing at the foot of her steps in a clean white shirt and a borrowed black coat, took off his hat and looked up at her as though he had never in his life seen anything so worth looking at. They were married that afternoon under the largest cottonwood at the bend of the river, by the same gray-bearded circuit preacher who had buried Eliza May 3.5 years before, with Whitcomb Pell standing as Rafe's best man, and a kind older woman from the church named Mrs. Hester Boone standing for Adeline, and Sheriff Elias Hammond and Joseph Two Rivers and the freckled boys Sully and half of Stillwater Bend gathered on the grass behind them. And when the preacher asked Adeline if she took this man, she did not whisper her answer the way brides sometimes whisper. She said, "I do," in a voice clear enough to carry across the river, and a meadow lark answered her from a fence post 50 yards off, and folks who were there that day told the story for years afterward in exactly that way, with the bird and the bride and the one bright word. They built a real house that summer on Adeline's land, A sturdy log home with 2 rooms and a wide porch and a window in the kitchen that looked out across the prairie to the cottonwood, where Eliza May slept under new grass. And Rafe carved his daughter's name, for she was his now 2, in the only way that mattered, into the lintel above the kitchen door, so that her name was the first thing the morning sun touched every day when it came in. They kept a small herd of their own, 50 head to start, and they took in, the second winter, a half-starved orphan boy named Tobias, who had wandered down from the Blackfoot country with no people of his own, and they raised him as a son. And in the 3rd spring, Adeline bore a child of her body, a strong, dark-haired girl they named Mary Eliza, after a schoolteacher in Colorado, and a baby in the prairie grass. And the cottage of grief became, slowly and without anyone planning it that way, a house full of light. But the deepest thing that grew on that piece of land was not the house, and not the herd, and not even the children. The deepest thing that grew was Adeline herself. The woman who had stood 3 years and 4 months behind a black silk veil became, year by quiet year, a woman the country around Stillwater Bend learned to send for, the one who sat the long nights with new mothers, who washed the dead for burial, when no one else could bear to, who taught the school children their letters on Wednesdays in the little church, when a regular teacher was ill, who could be counted on, in any house where grief had moved in, to come through the door with a covered dish and a long, careful silence, and a hand that knew how to hold another hand without flinching from its weight. Folks stopped saying the widow Voss about her, and they stopped saying the drover's wife. And after a while they simply said Adeline, the way you say the name of a fixed star, because she had become, without ever meaning to, a small steady light that other lonely people could steer by. If she was ever asked, and she was sometimes by a young woman bent under a sorrow of her own, how she'd come back from the country she had lived in for those 3 years and 4 months, Adeline McAllister would set down whatever was in her hands and think a long while, and then she would say something like this, in the slow, careful way she now had of choosing her words. Grief, child, is a country, and you are allowed to live there a while. It is holy ground. Do not let any soul rush you off it before your time, but do not build your only house there either. The veil you have learned to wear has carried you when nothing else would, and you must thank it for that. And then, on the morning you are ready, you must let some kind hand untie it, and you must let the river carry it. You will not be betraying the ones you have lost by stepping out of black. You will be honoring them, because the dead, child, do not want our shrouds. The dead want our singing. And then she would touch the young woman's hand, and she would say the rest of it, the part she had learned the hardest. You are not what was done to you. You are not the worst night of your life. You are not the names a cruel man called you across a porch in front of his hired men. You are a soul, child, and a soul cannot be deeded away by any forged paper. And a soul cannot be burned out by any kerosene can. And a soul cannot be silenced by any veil, no matter how long you have worn it. There is a girl inside you that the world tried to bury, and she is still down there, and she is still breathing, and one of these mornings of kindness is going to find her, a neighbor on a bank, a stranger at a door, a hand held out across a cold river, and you will know her again when you see her, because she will have your eyes. Rafe McAllister lived a long life beside her. He never again rode the long trail. The trail had brought him where he was meant to be, and a man who has come home does not need to keep going. He grew gray at the temples and stiff in the right shoulder where a horse had once thrown him, and he never stopped tipping his hat to her across a room, even after 40 years of marriage, because some habits a decent man does not let weather wear out. And on the porch of the log house, on summer evenings, when the meadowlarks were settling and the sky over the bittersweet was going pink as the inside of a shell, he would sometimes reach across the small space between their 2 rocking chairs and lay his sun-browned hand palm up on the arm of hers, the way he had laid it on her kitchen table on a blizzard night long before, and Adeline would slip her thin fingers into his without ever taking her eyes off the country, and the 2 of them would sit there in the soft last light, and neither one would say a word, because the sound of a long love at peace with itself is a quiet sound, and there is no need to speak over it. So if you have ridden along this far, friend, and if there's a veil somewhere in your own life that you've been wearing longer than you meant to, a sorrow grown heavier than iron, a name somebody once called you that you've been carrying like a saddle that was never yours to carry, hear this. Gentle as a hand on a cold river, you are allowed to set it down. You are allowed to let some kind morning untie it. You are allowed to come up out of the dark water and stand in the sunrise with your face uncovered. And you are allowed, dear soul, to be loved in the daylight by someone who will never ask you to go back behind the cloth. Grief is not a sentence. Shame is not a deed. And no human heart, however long it has been quiet, is ever truly past the season of its own singing. Ride safe, friend. Keep your hat on in the wind, and your hand open at the table, and your kindness ready at the door, because somewhere on some cold gravel bar at first light, there's always a soul standing knee-deep in a river, waiting on a slow rider, waiting on a quiet word, waiting on the small holy mercy of being seen.